I had been working at the warehouse for almost a year. At first, it seemed like just a regular job, nothing out of the ordinary. The night shifts had their own kind of peace to them. The night, the warehouse, the silence. But every night, I began to notice things that couldn't be explained. At first, they were small details, but over time, it all became harder to ignore. First, there were the sounds, strange, incomprehensible rustling noises that came from a distance. I tried to ignore them. I was used to these sounds. It was part of the job. But then, one night, everything changed. That evening was dark and quiet. When I arrived for my shift, everyone else had already gone home. I was left alone in the silence that filled the warehouse. Only the sound of my footsteps echoed through the large, empty hallways that branched off in every direction. The work was monotonous, stocking products, checking paperwork, moving boxes. I had gotten used to this rhythm, when suddenly again, the same sound. It was a crack, light, almost imperceptible, but loud enough for me to hear. At first, I thought it was some mechanical malfunction. I kept going with my work, but a few minutes later, I heard it again, the crack, followed by a rustling noise, as though someone was moving quietly through the warehouse. I stopped for a moment and listened, but saw nothing. It could have been anything, a creaking wall or old shelves shifting under the weight. I decided to ignore it, but then things got worse. I walked toward one of the corners of the warehouse where the heavy boxes were stored. And there it was. The surveillance camera, which was supposed to be off at this time, suddenly powered on. At first, I thought it was just a system glitch, and I even tried to turn it off. But the camera didn't just turn on, it started moving on its own. My fingers went cold, and my heart started pounding with fear. I knew this shouldn't be happening. I looked around the room. It was empty, except for me. No one could have been in the warehouse but me. But why was the camera moving? I checked the cables, the power system. Everything seemed normal. I took a deep breath and, trying to calm myself, I left the room. When I came back a few minutes later, the camera was turned off. It just wasn't working anymore. This caused even more fear. Something wasn't right. So, I began checking other cameras, trying to figure out if it was just one system glitch. But none of the cameras acted like this one. This was something strange. I started hearing the sounds again. At first, it was a faint whisper. It seemed insignificant, until I realized the whisper was growing louder and clearer. I started turning around and saw shadows moving from one spot to another, as if something invisible was watching me. I felt goosebumps run down my spine. I quickly moved through the warehouse, trying to leave it all behind, but the shadows wouldn't leave me. Soon, I realized they were following me, changing positions when I turned. I stopped, looked around, no one was there, but the feeling of being watched became even stronger. All these invisible presences, the eerie silence. They wouldn't let me go. I decided to return to the surveillance camera, hoping to turn it off completely, just to get some relief from the tension. But when I reached the place where the camera had been, I saw something that stunned me. The camera was on again, and this time it wasn't just moving, it was aimed directly at me. I felt the blood drain from my face. I couldn't believe my eyes. Someone or something was controlling that camera. I hastily left the room, not knowing what to do next. Something inside me knew this wasn't just a system error. It was more than that. And then it happened. I heard footsteps getting closer to me. And though I was absolutely sure no one could be here, the steps came nearer. I froze, but I couldn't turn around, couldn't find the courage to look. Then I heard the whisper again, this time louder, more menacing. The whisper began to form words. Run, or you'll become part of this. I swallowed several times, unable to make sense of what was happening. I dropped everything and ran. It was like a trap. The warehouse that had once felt safe now felt alien, dangerous. I ran, not knowing where to go, but I couldn't stop. The footsteps were getting closer. It felt impossible. I could hear them, but I couldn't see anyone behind me. I think I've been running for hours, not knowing where the end was. I didn't hear the footsteps anymore, but that didn't help me calm down. I slowly stopped when I realized I couldn't move anymore. At that moment, I began to feel the ground beneath my feet trembling. It was like something powerful and unseen was sliding beneath the surface. That's when I realized this wasn't just my imagination. I don't know how I left the warehouse that night, but I do know one thing. After that moment, I never worked another night shift there. What I experienced changed me. Something started following me, and it never let go. And now I know the warehouse is no longer just a place to work. It was a trap waiting for its next victim. I had worked as a diver in the rescue service for over 5 years. The job was dangerous, but in most cases predictable. Searching for missing boats, assisting fishermen, retrieving debris from the water. Over time, I learned to ignore the horrifying things I had to witness. The water hides many secrets, and not all of them are pleasant. But that one incident still lingers in my mind, despite all my attempts to forget it. It happened in the fall. The water temperature had already dropped to a critically low level, and there were hardly any people left on the lake, except for the die-hard fishermen. One of them came to us with a strange message. His sonar had picked up a faint SOS signal coming from just beneath the water. At first, we thought it might be some old navigation buoy or wreckage from a sunken ship sending false signals. But the man insisted that the signal was clear and repeated every 10 minutes, as if someone were manually sending it. I didn't believe in mystical stories. The lake wasn't very deep, and any objects on the bottom were usually well known to divers and cartographers. However, by protocol, we had to check the source of the signal. The water was cold, nearly ice cold, and the deeper we went, the darker the abyss around us became. The light from our flashlights only illuminated a few meters in front of us, the rest fading into the darkness. At about 40 meters deep, we saw it. The boat. It didn't resemble the old sunken ships that are usually found in such places. Its hull was almost intact, with no significant signs of rust or damage. If it weren't for the thick layer of mud on the deck, you might think it had sunk recently. What was most unsettling was that the signal was coming from right there. My partner gestured to ask what to do next. I decided to approach and try to look inside. As I got closer, I noticed details that made me freeze. The portholes were intact, but covered with a thin layer of algae. The door to the cabin was tightly shut, yet the lock looked as though it hadn't been touched in years. I peered through the window. Someone was inside. I made out the figure of a man sitting in a chair in front of the control panel. His head was slightly tilted forward, and his hands rested on the armrests. He didn't move. Even through the murky water, I could make out details. His skin was pale, almost bloodless, and his eyes were closed. The sensation was that he had simply fallen asleep, waiting for someone to wake him up. But he couldn't be sleeping. He couldn't be alive. The ship had been underwater for at least a few years, possibly decades. And then my partner and I heard the signal again. It seemed to be coming from inside the boat. I instinctively looked at my partner. He had heard it too, and looked just as bewildered as I did. The body was dead, but someone was sending an SOS signal. We decided not to take any risks and headed back to the surface. But before doing so, I looked into the window one last time. The man was no longer sitting in the chair. I distinctly remembered his position, and I was sure he couldn't have moved. But now his body was slightly shifted, as if he had barely changed position. I was overcome with the feeling that we were being watched. We quickly turned around and swam up, trying not to think about what we had just seen. As soon as we got back onto the boat, I ripped off my mask and took a deep breath of air. I was shaking. My partner looked no better. We immediately relayed the coordinates to the military, who were supposed to check the site and retrieve the boat. The next day, a group of divers with professional equipment arrived, but they found nothing. The boat was gone. The lake was relatively small, and searching it wasn't an issue, but there was nothing at our coordinates. No wreckage, no traces. The rescuers chalked it up to mudslides, possible underwater currents, or simply our mistake. But I knew there had been no mistake. A few days later, I accidentally remembered another troubling detail. When my partner and I descended to the boat, my watch had stopped. It just stopped working the moment we reached 40 meters deep, and it still doesn't work. But the worst came later. A week later, I received a call from the same fisherman. He had heard the SOS signal again. I've always enjoyed walking through forests, especially when I was younger. It was my place for reflection, where I could escape the hustle and bustle of life and find peace. Every time I walked along the forest paths, I felt the noise and chaos of the city fade away, and it was just me and nature. But that day was supposed to be different. This forest wasn't like the others. It was far from the main trails, and people rarely ventured here. Rumors said that this place wasn't entirely safe. Some had seen strange shadows. Others claimed there were unexplained noises at night that made your hair stand on end. But that didn't scare me. I'd always been drawn to places where there were fewer people and more silence. So, I decided that this forest would be my next destination for a walk. I set out at dawn, when the forest was still shrouded in darkness and mist. As soon as I took my first step deeper into the woods, I immediately felt that everything here was somehow different. There were no usual bird sounds, just dead silence, which felt as heavy as oxygen. Each of my steps echoed in the stillness, and it made me feel uneasy. I walked deeper and deeper until I reached a spot where the forest grew thicker, and the ground beneath me became soft and marshy. But ahead of me, a small clearing appeared where an old house stood. It looked as though it hadn't been touched in years, dark, mold-covered windows and doors that were half closed. The house seemed worn, like something forgotten by time. A sense of unease started to rise within me, but curiosity got the better of me. I approached the door, which suddenly swung open, though I hadn't even touched it. A chill washed over me, almost physically. I had the unsettling feeling that something was watching me. Something, or someone completely invisible. I couldn't resist, so I stepped inside. The room was dark. I could only see shadows slowly moving across the walls as I opened the door. Once inside, I saw her. She was sitting in the corner of the room, an old woman with a pale face that seemed to blend into the darkness. Her eyes were unusually pale, almost unnatural. She stared at me silently, without a single gesture or movement, like a shadow from the past. I took a few steps forward, trying to say something, but my words got lost in the depths of that unnatural silence. Her presence seemed to fill the room with an invisible force, as if the darkness itself responded to her existence. Her gaze was so deep and vacant that I felt as though she wasn't just observing me with her external eyes, but with some invisible inner vision that penetrated into my soul. The silence grew heavier. The sensation of time began to blur with the very air, which felt as if it were thickening. Every move I made reverberated in that silence, and I began to feel as though every cell in my body was responding to this strange state. This silence wasn't normal. It was alive, as if it was changing the reality around me. I noticed that around me, the room didn't look like an ordinary abandoned house. The ceiling was low, and it seemed that with every step I took, it lowered further, pressing down on my body. All the old objects filling the room started to look not just like forgotten things, but as though they each had their own stories, their own lives hidden from me. I looked at her hand. It was thin and frail, and she was holding an amulet. The amulet looked ancient, with intricate, tangled lines that resembled the roots of a tree. It had a design that seemed to merge with the very nature of the forest. I couldn't help but notice that her face became more expressive when her hand tightened around the amulet. It was like some internal tension, a moment when everything freezes, and you realize you're standing on the edge of something unpredictable. Once again, the room became utterly still, but this stillness felt so palpable that I could feel it pressing on me from all sides. The forest outside the window seemed to change. Its trees, even without wind, began to move as if they had a will of their own. And this movement was invisible, but it made everything feel worse. All my attempts to leave seemed futile. Then, when I began to feel as if I couldn't breathe, I felt a hand on my neck, growing heavier. The ground beneath me became soft and shifting, and everything around me began to sink into an invisible bog. I realized that these walls, these trees, and even the earth itself seemed to be alive. They were part of something greater, and I had become part of it.